Yeah, well, he was gonna do javelin, but they got a javelin coach. So now he's probably just gonna.
But all.
Ready?
Are we
Time to celebrate.
We're good.
Good evening.
She was talking about.
Good evening and welcome to the July meeting of the Granville Executive Board of Education. Thank you for being here tonight. Would you please rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Here. A couple of things to note this evening. One solemn and one celebratory, such as life, I think. First, on the solemn note, we were advised today that Don Scriven, who was a longtime counsel for the board and the district in a number of important matters over the years, passed away suddenly this weekend. And I thought it was worth mentioning to note that he was someone who was everything great about a lawyer. He was wise, he was patient with fools like me, he was thoughtful, scholarly, he was a gentleman. And he served us well, he served the community well for a number of years, and we'll miss him, and we're better off for having worked with him for a couple of years. But sad that he's gone.
Yeah, so for those of us that have had the pleasure of working with Don, his sense of humor is what you notice most immediately. He makes relatively tense conversations fun. And so it is shocking. And I just think that this community needs to understand Don's influence behind the scenes. Because he was absolutely critical in a lot of negotiations, and doing negotiations in a way that valued both perspectives, the teachers and the administration's perspectives. And I think that's a rare person, and that's a great way to describe Don, rare.
On a celebratory note, and I hate to make this transition as awkward as it is, I'd be remiss if we didn't note that our colleague, Mr. Wolf, is celebrating his 60th birthday. We are so thrilled that you're here and celebrating it with us.
I'm happy to be here, to be able to celebrate.
Yes.
Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
Um,
Is there cake?
It depends on how well we do this.
Actually, once we get the commendation, your lovely wife
Oh,
your
that was
60
nice.
cupcakes.
We're emphasizing the age of it.
Yeah.
You know, it is what it is, so.
Yes.
Commendation.
Sure, sorry. Okay. All right, good evening. Tonight we get to recognize a few of our Granville High School students for their placement in the Ohio State Hammer Championship held at the end of May. This event is not contested in regular high school meets, but in Ohio it's an event that the NCAA hosts a competition across the country. We are very proud of the wonderful accomplishments of our three senior students. Addison Hoover threw 155 feet and 4 inches to win the championship at Ohio State's Jesse Owens Memorial Stadium. She also finished as runner-up last March in weight throw during the indoor state meet. Parker Hilleman threw 174 feet and 5 inches to take 4th place, and Thomas Sheets threw 151 feet to take 11th place. Both Parker and Thomas also competed in the weight throws indoor. So congratulations to Coach Rich Hellman and Jim Green and our student athletes. That's a heck of an accomplishment. And it's so much fun to watch. I just worry that someone's gonna get injured. You know, the risk side of me goes, oh no, what's gonna happen? But it is really fun to watch, and congratulations. So come on up, please. Yeah, would you take it? Excellent. Here we go. Excellent. We're going to take a picture right here. Move in closer. There we go.
You want to do it? Kindness? Should I cut you off?
Everybody does. Thank you. And we are going to dive into the cupcakes at some point that Diana provided. So, happy birthday, Fred. We appreciate your service to the community. So we're glad you're still. So, all right. That concludes our commendations, and you may leave at this time if you would like. But you can stay for our regular meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Let's. Oh,
Yeah.
They break from around.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for buying us sandwich.
Jeff loves to do that.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
The only thing left is jazz.
Killing me,
Ray
Coach.
wants to do jazz.
Wow.
Ray wants to do jazz.
Let's.
It's because you took it to Flint
Hey,
Ridge
thank
and
you.
got to do it out loud. This is what comes of
If we're bringing back
educating.
Chaplin, we're putting in hockey too. And no
That's
coach.
your life, right?
All right.
Staff reports.
Yes, we have the June monthly financial report, which also happens to be our fiscal year end. So these are final numbers for FY19. Page 3 is just a very high-level summary. We brought in approximately $35,000 more than anticipated and spent approximately $162,000 more than anticipated. The key there was if you'll recall from our last meeting, approving the year-end advances, the grant funds, that shows up as an expenditure on the general fund in the first year, and then it will show up as an offsetting revenue in the following year to the general fund. So once we account for that, we actually ended cash $73,000 more than we had anticipated in that.
We like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's great news. So moving on to page 4, this is the format you're used to seeing with each line item kind of broken down there. The keys, just to point out, the income tax is on there. That was just a timing. We have not yet received our July. Thought we would have received it by now to give you an update, but that will have to come next month on where we ended for July. And then on the expenditure side, this is kind of a follow-through of May. I mentioned that we were a little bit over compared to prior years on supplies, but I believe that's probably just a timing thing that will kind of even out after year end. And then the last thing to note on this page, the very bottom line, the end of year outstanding purchase orders. That's kind of the difference between cash and accrual basis accounting. So our records are all cash basis. So we don't record the expense until we actually pay the bill, cash goes out the door. This $748,000 represents expenses that we have incurred, so that could be utilities that aren't billed until the following month, or orders that were placed in May and June that don't show up until later in July. So that's what that represents. So essentially that amount carries over into our budget for the next fiscal year. Then flipping over to page 5, this is a look at the trend, and we actually have, with fiscal year 19, we actually have 4 years of actuals and then 4 years projected out. So this shows you the year-over-year percentage change, and also kind of the difference between our revenue coming in and expenditures in each fiscal year. So the thing to note here is kind of the trend, the historical trend with the cash balance line downward sloping. Because of the cuts that were made last spring, we were able to reduce our expenditures over a prior year, and then that, with the passage of the income tax, then that green line starts sloping upward as we bring in more cash than what we're spending in each of those subsequent years. Moving on to page 6. This was kind of something we talked about last meeting, taking a look at some per pupil expenditure measures. The challenge here, and something that I'd like for us to talk about kind of on an ongoing basis, is there's multiple different measures that are kind of out there for the public consumption. There's the CUP report and then the ODE state report card. They're very different, as you can see with the numbers and what's included in them. So I've also included the general fund expenditure per pupil, which is just a straight, the amount that you can pull off the 5-year forecast, divide that by the number of students, to kind of have a measure for fiscal year 19, since the CUP report and the ODE state report card are a little lagging in time. I put that on there as well. So the thing to note with the general fund expenditure per pupil, obviously we were creeping up every year from FY15 through 18, and then we saw a reduction for FY19, which is what we had anticipated. And then I would expect to see the same thing as far as the trend goes for these 2 other measures. It's just a difference of the actual dollar amount. So the thing to keep in mind is just being consistent in which measure that we use as we move forward and evaluate kind of where we want to go down the road.
Is there one that you would recommend?
For me, the general fund, just being able to pull a report from our accounting system on the fly and kind of track where we are is the easiest way and most timely. So that is something that I would recommend. If we wanted to take certain aspects out, for example, if we wanted to look at taking out like open enrollment or charter school expenditures, and then we can clearly identify and still pretty easily run those numbers, that would kind of be my recommendation, as opposed and kind of staying away from the reports that don't come out for a year, because it's kind of hard to act on that when you're already kind of a year behind.
Right.
If that makes sense.
No, I think that makes sense. So what you would take out, the open enrollment and the charter schools, those are expenses that are going elsewhere. We're assessed with them, but they're not being applied here
Right.
in our buildings.
Yeah, so we would want to try to isolate as much as possible our actual cost for educating students in our district.
Thank you. And then the operating expenditure per pupil, you've broken that out on the bottom. That's non-classroom, so is that going to be more along the lines of capital expenses, capital investments?
So there's the ODE report card is probably the most complex of the 3. And I can bring the chart and attempt to walk us through how they do it. But they essentially start with the fund and subtract out certain funds, and then do it based on certain function codes, and then some go into operating, and then some are classroom, non-classroom, so it's a very complex formula. But so actually non-classroom would exclude capital expenses.
It's food service, custodial, all those
Security
things. Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So how do we get to a number, it's sort of a 2-part question. How do we get to a number that's most representative of what we're spending? If the community member says, what am I getting for my investment? Right, it's operating costs, it's capital expenses, it's non-classroom expenses. How do we get to a number there that we can measure from year to year to year? That's question number 1. And this follow-up question on that is, and how do we then get to break that out into those categories so that we can look at where the most, there's the most fluctuation?
I do think that the report card is attempting to do that, as complex as it may be. So that's definitely a measure that I think we should look at more closely, and then just find a way to replicate it quickly throughout the year to be able to measure it, as opposed to relying on ODE to release the
Once a year,
information.
right.
But I think we can follow their model as much as possible, because it does do a pretty good job of lumping it into categories that make sense to people that don't deal with this every day. So I think looking at that a little closer would,
So we can take those metrics and apply it to our accounting system.
right,
And generate it that way, which makes the most sense, instead of waiting on it, as you said, on an annual basis.
right.
When
It has been
it's
hard.
useful but late.
Yeah, it has been hard. I will say this too, I've attempted in the past to reconcile back to the report card, following the very complex model and filtering out and sorting and trying to replicate it. So I've gotten pretty close, but it's not always exact. So just warn against that too, when we try to replicate their numbers. It's a bit of a science.
It's good that it's also kind of more of a known public metric, right? Like I like an internal metric if we really know we can use it, the fact that it means something to us, but like, you know, there's always times when people compare us to other districts or compare us to the past, and they sort of trust other data sources and so forth, right? So it's nice to have one metric like that. And I really like it per pupil, because it seems to resonate with folks, and it's a good metric for us, you know, if the per pupil number is changing for some special reasons as well, right? Because enrollment changes or staffing changes that drive for driven by something else, special needs and so forth, right? We can kind of rationalize that. So this is a great page to have with all the different per pupil numbers, but I think, like you said, kind of consolidating on one and having one that's more of a regular metric for us, I think will resonate.
Yeah, I think as long as we have a number that we know, that we're taking it from the same data, so we can rely on it, right, and measure change over, month over month or year over year change, and look at it that way. I think, to me, that's our biggest challenge going forward. On page 3, you have expenses and revenues that you track through the next 5 years. One of the things that I think we need to look at carefully, we talked about this during the levy campaign, is we have, the community's grace, some additional money to spend on things that we've deferred over a long period of time, capital expenses primarily. But we'll need to make sure we're appropriately understanding and managing where the growth in those expenses is and what's driving it. The projected operating expenses over the next several years is a little higher than I'd like to see it, but that may well be because, as we talked about, there may be enrollment growth embedded in there may be other things embedded in there. So I would really like to see us, I think, spend more time on those issues, and I know Mr. Brown has suggested maybe a work session on that, just to really dive into the budget projections over the next several years, and make sure that not only are we fully comprehending where those growth numbers, what's driving those growth numbers, but also ways in which we might impact them. And I also think, and Brittany, we talked about this, happy to have you put your stamp on this report in the way that you think represents the work product you want to share with us, with the community. So anyway, my suggestion initially was we should maybe bring this back up for discussion here at the board level in September. But I think maybe September may or may not work, but I think I'd love to see us have a work session when we can all get together and talk through this and spend time just really opening this up and making sure we're getting out of it what we want to see.
I think anytime you're trying to create a metric, knowing what is in and out of the metric is essential in helping you determine what you're going to do with that data. And so I think it is important to understand what's in our control, what's out of our control, because that will shape kind of our direction moving forward. Right? And it gets complicated. surprising. You would think it'd be less complicated, but it never is. It gets more complicated. So I really like this chart. I think this really resonates, and finding the best measure that we can replicate on our own, I think would be helpful for future planning.
Well, if you would, if the board will indulge me on this, I'd like to maybe think about coordinating a date on the calendar that works for everyone for a work session, mostly focused on revenue, but overall just financial health and what we're doing going forward, so that we're all as informed as we can be, and we all can ensure that we're seeing all the data that we want.
I will have you coordinate that. Okay?
But I like these additions we made.
Thank you. Would it be helpful to do a deeper dive into the report card measure and how that works maybe in August before
Yeah.
the September work session?
Yeah,
Just
that's
so we
okay.
get informational.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah, and if we can look, we can maybe apply a formula historically to see kind of how it applies historically, and kind of look at some more trending data relative to that deeper in history and further in the forecast as well, to see which one of these kind of gives us some insights about the direction we're headed. I think it's the right time. You know, when we don't have a levy on the agenda to be talking about finance stuff in detail, right? Because we have important decisions to make over the next years that are going to influence, the finances in the out years, that we can't do the year before levy. We can't, just riff when we have to riff a little bit and so forth. We need to come up with a stable, right, long-term plan that's going to be supported and sustainable.
Sorry, I didn't mean to dominate
Oh,
that discussion.
no, that's okay, that's great. The last two pages are just the same as you've seen in the past, the cash balance over the next fiscal year, and showing that we are going to be above our benchmark there. And then just kind of a copy of the cash reconciliation. This is all funds, and this is something that the auditor sees as part of our, part of our monthly financial statement. Any other questions or concerns, comments about the format? It's slightly different than what you've seen in prior months, so just as much as possible, like to get your feedback as you see different things, what's helpful, what's not, and that will help you going forward. Try to find a format that works for all of us.
Yeah, I like the additions and colleagues in the treasurer's office come in here. We'll continue to review these offers. Thank you.
Okay. Student handbook update. So in the last meeting, there were a couple of topics brought up related to the student handbook that I wanted to provide just a more formal and public response to, so that we have an understanding. So one of the main issues was the senior picture change, which I didn't necessarily fully understand. And so we are going to actually change that language back to what we have always had in our handbook, which is, a process that allows people to go out, get their senior pictures and turn them in. I think the challenge for us, and I want to make this statement, is making sure people actually apply or stick to our deadlines, so that we don't spend energy and resources trying to track down photos. So, as much as senior parents can help us with that, there's a lot going on, but we would appreciate that. But we're going to go status quo for the next year. The other kind of topic or statement that was made was around attendance, and with, I think what I want to reiterate is that we will continue to work with families to the extent possible by law, that we can, provide flexibility for them to take opportunities that enrich their learning. Again, understanding, dealing with the confines of compulsory education and what we have to deal with. But I think we've done a very good job of managing opportunities in a way that is beneficial not only to the district for reporting standpoints, but also for the students. So we'll continue to do that. One thing not related to the handbook that I wanted to circle back on, though, is I shared a draft of the Portrait of a Graduate, got some feedback from a couple people, and what we did was we made a slight tweak to one of the competencies. Instead of using curious, we use critical thinker, because critical thinking obviously was highly rated in the community and stakeholder input process. And a lot of the descriptors that are embedded under critical thinking are things that elevate innovation, critical thinking, curiosity, inquiry, that we feel can adequately represent what we're trying to get at from a competency standpoint. So we made that slight tweak. Battelle for Kids is working on putting it in a format that is going to be our final product. And Mr. Bernath has tweaked our Granville Learning Foundations to include those competencies into the Learning Foundations. It looks very nice. He did a great job. And I'm looking forward to the beginning of the school year where we can roll this out to staff and start to actually see this come alive in the classroom. I think a theme for the 1920 school year related to the Portrait of a Graduate is bringing it to life. We've talked about learning for life. This is about, bringing the portrait to life. So very excited about that work. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
We are now at the point in our agenda where we welcome public comment. If anyone would like to step forward and offer comments, please do so.
No?
We'll even waive the time.
This might be a good time for cupcakes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I might start serving.
I know Bernad's on it.
Always ready.
Here, Fred, we'll start with you. Now, do we want to actually, we could like candles.
There are
Not
matches.
We don't need to.
Here, grab a cupcake.
Well, thank you.
Fred is very thoughtful of you having a birthday.
I'm so glad we scheduled the board meeting.
I'll be right back.
Oh, thanks.
All right, guys.
I'll have to talk to Mrs. Wolf.
I'm gonna let you dig in here.
Feel free. Yeah.
All right.
Would you let them?
You were sitting there waiting, right?
What kind?
Get to the cake cupcakes.
I didn't know I had a choice.
Doesn't matter to me. The sweet kind.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
It was a nice little intermission.
Think so. Do you guys want?
Yeah, I'll take a chocolate.
Still waiting on
please.
public comment in case.
I know. In case any of you decide to talk.
I think you're just on the same side you were on.
That's good.
Thank you very much. Ryan wants a chocolate one too. Oh, Ryan wants a vanilla one. Thank you.
We're gonna have snack
I
every
think so.
month now.
Yeah.
At public.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Come on that platform.
Yeah.
Oh,
you got-
I know how this crowd eats.
Yeah.
Hey, Dr. Corman goes away for one meeting and it all.
I know.
Thank you.
You're going to get the cupcake and the frosting.
Who needs them?
Everybody.
Probably all of us.
Glenn clearly needs one. Shh. How'd you get it up there on your cheek? All right.
All right.
More discussion.
Best
That was
board
just
meeting
it, wasn't
ever.
it?
Yeah.
Board discussion, we have on there the state budget, which I know is freshly printed. You want to tee it up a little bit?
Actually, I'm going to let Brittany tee it up
All right.
to talk a little bit about, the implications for the 5-year forecast and actually just understanding what's in the bill.
So the hard thing is it's July 22nd, and we are just now looking at revenue for the current year that started 22 days ago. So one of the issues with that is that you have to do hiring and make decisions about programming before you see your revenue forecast. So that's one thing to keep in mind during this discussion. But just as an overview of the way the so-called formula, that's not a formula, will work for this year, is we are going to be flat funded based on FY19 revenue. So there are certain things that are included in that and certain things that are outside of that. So one thing that's included in that is career tech. So as you know, we added our program at the high school that under the formula would have generated additional revenue for us, but being that we're flat funded, we will not see that piece of revenue that we were anticipating. But instead, there is a little bit of a silver lining. So House Bill 166 includes what they're calling student wellness and success funds. So those are going to be restricted funds, but there's no supplant rule. So there are certain things that are in the bill that we can use that money to fund. But if we already have those services that we're already providing, we can essentially do like a swap and say, okay, the student wellness funds are gonna pay this, and then we can use the other revenue to do something else. So that does allow us for some local flexibility in how we want to use those funds. So for FY20, that's expected to be a little less than 95,000. And then for FY21, there's a little bit of a growth. So the data that's used to determine these numbers are not going to change. So in other words, our poverty and growth rates and ADM are all locked in as far as what we get in FY20 compared to 21. So they changed increased the per pupil amount, so we will see an increase, but it's based on the same population, same data. So that'll go up to 134,000 for FY21. Then there is an enrollment growth supplement. So we're flat funded, but there's a growth supplement. So it's kind of confusing, but it does generate some additional funds for us. They looked at FY 16 through 19 student population, determined a growth rate, and then that was applied to the per pupil amount. So
Is that an enrollment adjustment or a growth adjustment? So if your enrollment goes down, that is applied as well?
no, just a growth. Right. Yeah.
They didn't have enough time to figure.
Well, I mean, there are places that really need that, right? And that's really important,
Yes.
right? But if you're gonna do
That
you
is
should
the
have
only TNG and Lincoln
Johnstown.
Heights. And, I mean, Johnstown will be, their development will be outside of this budget, but it will
Okay.
hit them.
Yeah,
It will hit them hard.
yeah. And so I felt for those folks, and it was great that they incorporated that, but like, we can't keep it. Okay, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
That's okay. So for FY20, that's about 30,000. And then for FY21, that's about 44,000.
That was great.
So it's good compared to what we had in the forecast for May. So in other words, the numbers that we've been looking at each month since May, how does that compare? Because we did have some growth. So on Friday, I sent out just a rough estimate that showed a little bit better than where we were in May. But taking a look at where the flat funding line is on our state revenue, and that the career tech is above the line and what's below the line, and adjusting for that in our forecast, we're really gonna come in pretty close to where we already forecasted, which is good news. No loss is a win kind of situation, I think, is kind of where we're going with that.
Could be worse.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's kind of the gist of the funding piece.
Could be worse. However, the caution is, now that there's been flat funding applied for the next 2 years, when the next budget cycle is developed and there potentially isn't a formula, the starting place is now a 2-year lag with no inflationary growth. And that's where I think the real danger of a flat funding model is. As Thomas was saying, when you don't have a formula, it's hard to adjust the formula to a new reality. So I think that's, as much as we are somewhat held harmless through this process, there is still a looming cliff out there that I'm concerned about.
And it's more of an unknown than it's ever been. So when you hear any treasurer present the 5-year forecast, it's like, well, the state budget's only 2 years, and then we don't know. But I would say more so than ever, this is a big question mark. So for fiscal year 2022 and 2023, which is just crazy that those are the years we're talking about, I've not adjusted anything from the forecast until we have some time just to let this sink in and figure out where we are just for the current year. So just keep that in mind when you look at the forecast, the summary forecast that I provided with today's date on it.
And also in this report, you have not accounted for our current hiring.
Right, yes, so this was really just an update for the state budget in terms of revenue. This was not meant to be kind of an update as to where we are in total.
Thank you.
Any questions about that piece at all?
That's great to have that update. And so Patterson is sort of dead, except for 2 years from now, maybe since we've started this process, there's something that comes out, or is there some factor in there?
They have actually introduced a bill, so it will still be introduced and go through, hopefully, the legislative process relatively quickly, so that it could potentially be included in a future mid-year update, or a mid-biennium update, because they always do an MBE or something like that. But it's still a viable conversation, especially when the House had 67 co-sponsors on the bill. So I think it's just a matter of building capacity at the General Assembly for what Patterson does and does not do. A lot of people, there is no perfect formula. When you have a limited amount of money, there is no perfect formula. There are going to be people that potentially view it as a loss or a win. What we need to have is a solid rationale for why there are winners or losers in that process. So,
And the losses and the wins get worse if you have less funding for 2 years.
yes.
Right, because it's like really, there's no way to put a logical formula in place that makes sense today for what it was 3 years ago, or whatever your funding is based on, so.
Is there anything, I guess speaking more about Patterson potentially becoming introduced as a bill, is there anything that we can do as a board to lend support to that bill when the time is right?
I believe at the time, when the time is right, drafting a resolution of support of that work would be advantageous. Making sure that all of our, obviously Scott Ryan is very intimately involved, very supportive, but, making sure that Senator Hottinger knows our perspective and then we can share that with the rest of the General Assembly.
And really the big issue was in the Senate anyway.
Correct. That's
And I think we should take advantage, the Speaker of the House represents part of this county
Yes.
and represents part of our district. That we ought to work with him as well.
Yes. I agree.
Fred, are there, I know you have particular knowledge there, are there things we ought to do in addition to a resolution? Should we reach out to the Speaker?
I don't think it hurts. I would say sooner rather than later, but let them get a couple of these, he wants to get his energy bill through, and there's a couple of things he wants to get done, but everything, I'd be curious what you're hearing down on Camp Square is, he's not willing to give up on this, which I think is encouraging.
I agree with you. I think the only challenge for us is one of the reasons why the concept or the plan kind of fell through at the last minute was the perception perception that, well, these school districts won't get any more. So if we come out too strongly in support too early, it might be confirmation for some people that they think that somehow we're gonna get a windfall. Granville's not gonna get a windfall in the Patterson, but we will have a planning mechanism for Brittany to try and figure out what the 5-year forecast might be in future planning. But, so I think that's the only caution, but I think you're right. Householder was very much keeping this on the front burner. And I think we just have to work with the Senate to make sure that they understand, and the governor's office, quite honestly, to understand the implications.
And hopefully that's something the OSBA and some of these other organizations will be helpful, that we're members of,
Yes,
in getting some attention to this.
yes. And I shared this with them, with BASA, but I was a little disappointed with BASA's approach to the governor's proposal. Yes, he did invest $675,000 or $1 million into education, which is good, but in absence of a formula, it creates a point where we're going to have very difficult conversations, and those are never positive. So I think BASA needs to move in the right direction and understand that having a funding formula is better in aggregate for all Ohio school districts than some additional revenue right now. It's short-term, long-term. And you know, anytime you make a short-sighted or short-term decision that impacts your long-term outcome, it's usually not positive. You want to look at the end game.
It's, you know, it's just awfully tough to run a business or run a household when you don't know what your revenues are and project your expenses. Well, I think it bears watching from our perspective, and when the time is right, I think we ought to continue to weigh in with the Speaker's office and with Senator Auditor's office and anybody else that you think is appropriate. And perhaps we, with respect to Senator Auditor, perhaps if warrants are requesting a meeting as opposed to just sending a letter, see if we can explain clearly what our position is and what our concerns. Other comments? Anything else for board discussion? Thank you.
Thanks. Next is the board reports. I didn't put any board member because I was planning on speaking to this. So the Granville Education Foundation over the 4th of July held their Blue, White, and Boom event at the Granville Inn. And I believe the final numbers are that they made about $3,000 of additional revenue for their support of Granville schools. And from all accounts, it was very well attended because sometimes the weather helps, and when it starts to rain and you have a place to go that's dry and nice, it drove more of our alumni who were here to the event. So that was very positive, and I think, you know, one of the ultimate goals of the GEF is to, you know, really create that database of alumni that they over years can build for future support efforts of the school district as we look at more and more options of public-private partnerships.
Mr. Sen, there were many of younger alumni there?
There were a few. There were a few. We did ask, and it sounds like there were a few people that showed up, so that's a positive.
And I think this might have been their best year ever getting sponsors for the event. And so they did a very good job on putting that together, the sponsorship part of it.
It was at the end too, right?
It was at the end,
That's
it
right.
was very supportive,
That's
and
great.
It worked, I think, a lot from a logistics standpoint, better than Robbins Hunter, just because of
Good
the
deal.
actual facility.
yeah.
Great.
So,
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
right. That brings us to the action agenda. So 10.01 is the LACA service level agreement for the 1920 school year.
So moved.
Second?
And this is our service level agreement with the Licking Area Computer Association, also known as our ITC for internet services and technology.
Are they expanding the district still that they're serving and helping the costs go down because of that?
So there was a point where they were expanding. At this point, they're contracting slightly because I believe Medina is leaving LACA.
I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure it's Medina. So, but I think that's not a bad thing because I think they were allocating more resources to supporting that district that was kind of outside of their region anyway. So I think in general, the contract either stays the same or goes down every year. And we use E-rate revenue from the feds to offset some of that revenue that we expend.
Satisfied with the service and the responsiveness.
We all are always providing feedback to them about ways to improve. Was that an accurate statement?
Satisfied would have been the wrong.
Yeah, no, we are satisfied, but there is always opportunity for growth.
Thank you. Questions?
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Aye. Mr. Denise?
Aye. Thank you.
Thank you. Board policy updates, 10.02 is the approval of 2 new board policies.
So moved.
Second?
All right, as we discussed at the last board meeting, there are only 2 new board policy changes. One is the School Boards Association liaison, and then the use of electronic signatures. This is the second reading and final vote.
Questions?
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds? Aye. Mr. Denise?
Aye.
Thank you. 10.03 is the approval of the school age childcare contract with Love and Learning Child Care Center.
Second.
And this, we have applied a 2% increase, inflationary adjustment to their monthly total. But other than that, the contract is the same. We have not heard, we've heard very positive things about what they do.
Do we do any sort of formal surveying or reviewing of what's being provided and what the customer satisfaction is?
Yeah, we did 2 years ago, I believe, and that review was positive, and that led us to not going through a bidding process for this year, especially because we were bidding a lot of other capital projects. So, in the future, if the board would like us to go through a formal bidding process, that's something that we can entertain.
I think as long as we're, well, I don't know about the formal bidding process, I think probably it's useful on a periodic basis, but I think as long as we're reviewing and soliciting feedback from customers, it's, in a sense, this has our brand on it, so we're sealable approval, so I think it's important that we monitor that and make sure that we're satisfied with the level of service. I've not heard anything negative at all. I just think it bears,
Good practice.
it's good practice.
Yeah.
Questions?
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Denise?
Aye. Thank you.
Consent agenda. Including, oh, actually, let's do 10.04, which is on the addendum, which is the resolution authorizing the purchase of gas services.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so as you are aware, we are in a consortium purchasing process for gas services, and every year they go back out and try and find the best deal. This is authorizing that next contract or yearly approval, extension. Yes, thank you.
And do we have any metrics about that relative to how other districts do and how other contractors or other consortiums are, or how would we do on our own and so forth. I mean, I think it's a better deal to be a part of this than trying to lead, but yeah, how do we get a sense check that these are the right guys and this is the right thing to do? I don't know.
That's a great question.
You
Yeah,
know?
I think in the future, we can do some comparison. We've been with Direct Energy for a couple of years now. I think even back when Chuck Bilden was here. But I think that's something that the operations committee could look at as far as looking at other providers.
Yeah, I mean, it's always just nice to have a sense check about, it seems like it's a great process, it seems like it works well, but then I'm not sure what I'm comparing to.
Correct.
Right, so-
Yep. Fair question.
Questions?
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Jennings?
Aye.
Thank you. So now the consent agenda includes 1101A through C5.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so a couple of,
Quick question, it's not C5, is it? There's C8.
oh yeah, C8.
Oh, it was stuck in there.
Yes,
Okay.
C8. Thank you. Thank you, Russ. All right, a couple of things to highlight. Obviously, the donations, we received a $6,000 grant from high schools and middle schools that work. I really want to credit Matt and Lisa for going out and getting that grant. They write that on behalf of their schools for project-based learning and supporting the training that goes along with what we're doing with project-based learning. So fantastic, kudos to them. That saves us general fund revenue that is dedicated for professional development. So there's a good offset to the general fund. Employment contracts for supplementals. Jim Green will be an educational aide at the high school. Now he's currently our track coach, and he is going to be employed as an educational aide. We have the resignations of Mike Duncan, Grace Wagner, and Nate Evans. Mike Duncan has been doing our high school ski club advising for many, many years, and he's at the point where he's ready to move on. And then Grace Wagner has secured a position at a career technical center as a dean of students, and Nate Evans is going to Southwest Licking Schools. So we appreciate their service to this community in supporting our students' needs. And then we also have the approval of the kindergarten bus routes for next year. So other than that, everything's pretty good.
Comments, questions?
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Jennings?
Aye. Thank you.
Brings us to item 12.01, the June 2019 financial report. So moved.
Second.
I think we had a pretty lengthy discussion. Is there any additional comments, questions, concerns? This time?
Anybody? Are we incorporating the handout into that financial report?
I would just include that in more under board discussion,
Okay.
and then it's more of an update and.
Okay.
as
We're not
opposed
adopting
to-
that.
Correct, yeah.
Great.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Jennings?
Aye.
And item 12.02, the resolution to approve fund return of advances.
So moved.
Second.
This is the reverse of the resolution last month to approve the advances out of general fund into the grants. Now we're doing the grants back into the general fund. And then we will receive our reimbursements in the grants like normal throughout the rest of the year until September, when we do our final expenditure report for each of those grants.
Questions?
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Janice?
Aye. Is there a motion?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Ms. Deeds?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.